Hey guys, Gwen here from St. Louis County Parks, and today we have a special program for you from our curator at Jefferson Barracks, Tom Hoff. He's going to talk to us a little bit about his personal hobby, miniature wargaming. So this is an activity that we were hoping to host at Jefferson Barracks this year, but obviously due to COVID, that didn't happen. But we do hope to resume that activity in 2021. So here to tell you a little bit more about miniature wargaming is Tom Hoff. Thanks.
Hey there, cool cats and kittens. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Tom Hoff, the curator here at Jefferson Barracks, and I'd like to welcome you to our program regarding the hobby of miniature wargaming. Today we're going to be looking at it mostly from the perspective of historical miniature wargaming. There are also other options such as fantasy and science fiction, but we're going to focus on the history because we're from the history department. Now this year it's been kind of a bad year for doing things, and what we're hoping to do with this series of programs is to get people thinking about other hobbies involving military history. Obviously we'd love for you to be able to come and look at the museums and do things along this line, and while the museums are open, it's limited capacity and certain restrictions are in place. So what we're going to do is give you some options of things to think about to do at home, and with a limited amount of friends, and some things you can even play by mail. One of the first things to consider when you're getting into miniature wargaming is what scale you want to be playing at. Now chances are as time goes on you're going to be getting into a lot of different periods and playing things at different scale. Scale, of course, is a relationship between sizes, and it also represents, in a miniature wargaming type context, not only the size of the figures that you're using, but the command level you want to be playing at. So one of the first things we're going to talk about a little bit is scale. And we got a couple examples here of scale in different ways. Over here, you'll notice that there are several stands of very small figures. And these are 10 millimeter figures, and this represents a battalion of Viet Minh from the war in Indochina between the French and the Viet Minh in 1954. In the small stands, each one would represent a platoon, and this entire thing would be a battalion. So if you were playing with this kind of scale, you might be playing as a regimental commander or even a divisional commander, using a set of rules such as Blitzkrieg Commander, which is now up to its 4th edition, as your command level. In the center, we've got two platoons facing off, one of Viet Minh, one of French, and if you're playing a game like World War II Battlefront, this would be a company of troops. If you were playing a different game such as I Ain't Been Shot Mum, this would be a platoon of troops, and so your command level is changing. And also notice we've changed the miniatures level. These are bigger figures. They're 15 millimeter. Now it's not to say you couldn't play a command level scaled game like Blitzkrieg Commander with 15 millimeter figures and vice versa. It's just we wanted to illustrate how things can change in a couple of different ways. Last but not least, over here we've got a squad of French paratroopers from circa 1953, 1954, a la Battle of Dien Bien Phu. In a game such as this, every figure would represent one man, and you use them in a skirmish game where you'd be making decisions as a platoon commander or perhaps even as a squad commander. A game like Chain of Command would be perfect for that type of a situation. One of the other things you're going to probably want to do is a lot of research. Now, with the advent of the internet, that's a great tool. You can easily play around with that, but there's something good about having a book in your hands. And when I first became interested in wargaming back in 1969, what was available were books like The War Game by Donald Featherstone and compendiums such as this, Advanced War Games Campaigns, Charles Grant, George Gush, Donald Featherstone, I believe I mentioned him. These were the kind of pioneers of a hobby. a hobby that dates way back. Frederick the Great of Prussia, the great warrior king, was involved in miniature wargaming. In fact, Christopher Duffy, the great historian of Frederick the Great, and I were once discussing the need to find the rules that he used, as it would be kind of really cool to play 7 Years' War battles using Frederick the Great's own rules. So there's stuff that's out there. A lot of rule systems are very generic in that they'll cover broad spans of history, such as Ever Victorious Armies, which covers basically from the French Revolution through the Sudan campaign of 1885. Some are very, very specific. It's Getting a Bit Chilly is strictly geared for the Great War of the Pacific. So you've got options. You can go for something very hyper-focused, or you can get something very broadly based, and you can start to narrow it down from there and tweak it as you want. You're not limited to American sources either. The United Kingdom was a leading country for producing wargaming information. It sounds kind of patronizing and a silly thing to say, but it's the focal point of the hobby in many ways. There are magazines to support the hobby, like Wargames Illustrated, Wargame Soldiers Strategy, which come out of the UK, although Wargames WSS actually has a Dutch publisher. For example, Fire and Sword. It's a set of Polish wargaming rules for the latter part of the 17th century. So there's all sorts of really interesting things out of there. One thing you'll also find is there are sets of rules for different periods that are by the same designer, and they will kind of flow together. So once you learn how to play one game, you may have an easier time playing other games from the same family. General d'Armée, set of Napoleonic rules. Same author wrote Pickett's Charge, that set of Civil War rules. Different rules, but a lot of the mechanics are the same. So it's not like you're relearning all the mechanics, you're learning to play the same game. When I was in high school, we played a lot of medieval games using God's-Acre and Conditorei, and then eventually they came out with a set called Musketeer, which brought it all up into the Renaissance. So you can find what you want, and you might find a similarity to other game systems that make it easy. The other thing you're going to want to be looking at in terms of books is reference material for painting, because we'll be talking about you're going to want to paint your figures. These come in a wide variety of forms. Most common are the Osprey books, which have colored plates in the center. So you're getting reference material along with colored plates and information. There are equivalents from other countries as well. History and Collections in France does a great set of books with fantastic illustrations in them. Some things are custom designed for the wargamer. For example, Colors of War by the good people at Battlefront is specific instructions on how to paint their miniatures, right down to telling you what paint codes to use from Vallejo Paints. This makes things super simple. Also other texts, again, History and Collections, they do some phenomenal stuff on the Napoleonic Wars, and not only do they reproduce some fantastic pieces of art, such as this, that will give you pictures, ideas on uniforms, it also includes plates of uniforms, such as this, that will also give you what you need to know to paint. So reference material is out there, it's easily accessible, and there's no excuse for you not picking it up and doing a little work. Now we're going to be looking at a lot of 28mm figures during this talk because they're going to look better on film. So when we talk about getting back to talking about scale, that's what a lot of this is going to be, although we're going to have one 15mm table. If you're first getting started in miniature wargaming or you're working on a limited budget, sometimes skirmish games are the best way to go because you're using smaller amounts of figures. I'm a bit of a World War I fanatic, as anyone who's had to spend time with me will tell you, because they've heard about World War I, whether they wanted to or not. And so the guys I play with, we play a lot of World War I. So we got a trench system. And trench system is kind of as generic, it's been everywhere, but here we've got it laid out as though it's East Africa in 1914 or 1915 in the early days of World War I. And we have East African troops along with a smattering of German personnel holding the trench against an attack by the Indian Army. And we've got two platoons of Indian soldiers who are going to make an attack on this entrenchment, studiously avoiding the open area where the machine gun is covering, as that would be a disaster. For a game like this, there's a couple of different sets of rules you could use. You could use something like Contemptible Little Armies, which uses very flexible scaling. A game like that, units are between 8 and 18 figures, and that can represent anywhere from a squad to a corps, depending on what your thinking is. A fun game to play for these kind of games is Through the Mud and the Blood, which uses a card activation system. Some games are going to be I go, you go, where one side will do everything and then the other side will do everything. Ever since probably around 1979, 1980, with the introduction of the Sword and the Flame, card systems have become more popular for setting up movement. It's going to involve a little bit of fog of war because you're never sure what the next card is going to bring up. Some games would be very simple, like the Sword and the Flame. If it was a red card, it was British. If it was a black card, it was Zulus. If you're playing a game like Through the Mud and the Blood, every commander is going to have his own card. When that card comes up, that's when his troops are going to be able to move, shoot, do whatever. This is going to add an element of uncertainty to your game, and it's going to cause the best laid plans of mice and men to slowly fall apart because your opponent is going to constantly be reacting to what you're doing or forcing you to react to what he's doing. A lot more like real warfare. Now, working on the same line, we've got a 15mm game laid out here. This is somewhere on the Eastern Front in the winter of 1942 with Soviets attacking a German-held village. The figures themselves are mounted for a game called Flames of War, which is a very popular gaming system. Flames of War is probably the most used set of World War II rules right now. Their figures are produced by the company to support the game. Most of the Russians out here are from Flames of War. Most of the Germans are from Peter Pig. You can also play this with a game such as I Ain't Been Shot, Mum, which uses a card activation system like Through the Mud and the Blood. In fact, it's designed by the same guy. But it's a different command level. We're talking about scales, a different scale. Through the Mud and the Blood expects you to be playing about a platoon-sized action, sometimes bigger. I Ain't Been Shot, Mum is anywhere from a company to an understrength battalion on a side. And it'll give you a kind of a fun game. With a scenario like this, you can also start tweaking around and playing with special rules. For example, in reality, if the Russians were attacking over a wide open area like this, they would simply get massacred by a German machine gun fire. So you can play a game where you're saying it's a night attack, and all of a sudden, things not necessarily being seen. And so you include things like flares. Where is fired flare? And an arc around wherever the flare is popped, that's where things will be visible. A lot of gamers also like to pick up some markers to make a game more interesting. For example, we've got artillery bombardment markers hammering this little couple of houses over here, simulating mortar fire coming in from the supporting Russians, and the Russians are receiving the same back from the Germans. So you have got scope and scale with what you want to do. You want to play a night game? You can set up a game, a scenario for night. You can set it up for any kind of weather. You can take all sorts of things into consideration and tailor a game to be the type of scenario and situation that most interests you. World War II is, of course, one of the big periods for wargaming. A couple of other big ones are the American Civil War, the ancient era, particularly the battles of Rome, and the Napoleonic era, which is probably one of the most spectacular when it comes to uniforms. Not all Napoleonic battles were big. We have what's going on here is a battle actually from the War of the First Coalition, which is part of the French Revolutionary Wars, sometime circa 1792, and it's a skirmish action using sharp practice, which is a set of rules for large skirmish games involving anywhere up to 100 figures on a side. And we have going on a group of revolutionary French attempting to defend the farmhouse against some attacking Austrians and Dutch. To the one right flank of the farmhouse, we have French light infantry moving up, led by their big man, who is leading them forward. There are some of the old French whites coated regiment inside the farmhouse proper, some French chevaux de guerre, and of course the main part of the French force, a company or so of fierce conscripts marching forward with their skirmishers out working ahead, and they are faced off against some Dutch who are supported by a small unit of grenadiers, and then the Austrians that they are facing off against, the dreaded whitecoats themselves. It would be a unit of Austrian chevaux de guerre, some Austrian fusiliers marching forward, supported by an artillery piece, and some wonderful Grenzers skirmishing through the woods with a line behind them to support them. This sort of a game can be wonderfully entertaining. Get it over with in the space of a couple of hours, so it's perfect for an evening game with your wargaming club. And definitely a great game for brandy and cigars. We used to talk about beer and pretzels games. This would be a little bit more elegant than that. We've talked about some small games. We've shown some small games. Occasionally, megalomania is going to set in, and you're going to want to do something really, really big. This is where group games tend to come in handy, because if everyone in your wargaming club is painting the figures from the Napoleonic Wars, you're good to go. But we'll get more into that in a little bit. Instead, what I'm going to show you right now for the moment is an example of a large-scale war game. And this is an imaginary engagement during the First Anglo-Sikh War. It's very loosely based probably on the Battle of Aliwal, whose commander, General Smith, was told by the Duke of Wellington that he had fought the perfect battle. And we've got a collection of figures representing troops of the Sikh Khalsa, both auxiliary troops, real main line troops, cavalry, infantry, etc. We've got a British Honorable East India Company army of sepoys and British soldiers and Sovars and cavalrymen, and it all comes together and it looks wonderful. Very colorful type of a game. The rules, this is set up to be played with black powder, which is a simple set of rules to play, although it can be kind of complex in the way things roll out. You can have an incredible amount of fun with it. So this kind of a game can be very, very satisfying as well. Once you start getting into battles of the scope, it's very easy to start playing out historical scenarios and having a lot of fun. And this is kind of also when you start getting into strange little wars that are not necessarily at the top of everybody's consciousness. The story behind this war was the government of the Sikh kingdom up in the Punjab had a regular army, was trained on European standards with English and French instructors, predominantly French. And the army had managed to get so much political power that they became a threat to the establishment. And to make things very simple, the powers that be figured that if they fought a war against the English, their army would be destroyed. They could keep their independence, and they wouldn't have to worry about the threat from, the masses. Turns out their army didn't just easily get destroyed. It was eventually destroyed, but it took two separate wars to accomplish that. And the English were very, very impressed by the Punjab, which did not maintain its independence after the Second War and was absorbed into British India. And but the Sikhs became, of course, a very important part of the British Army in India, as well as into Indian society itself. The Sikh army wasn't all Sikh. It was also Muslim, and there were Hindu regiments as well. Interesting political entity. And this is where the history gets into it. I became interested in the Sikh War, mainly after reading some history about what had happened, and I became intrigued. It's an interesting war historically, it's an interesting war culturally, it's an interesting excuse to have chicken tikka masala from time to time. So you can find the periods of history that really intrigue you, and chances are you will be able to play those games. When I first got involved in wargaming back in the late 1960s, 69, and into the early 70s, there was a limited amount of figures that were on the market, and then a limited amount of scales. Plastic Airfix figures in 1/72nd scale were pretty much the norm, or the HOO scales they called it at the time. Metal figures were becoming more and more common, but way out of the price range of a child. And you were very limited to the Napoleonic Wars, Civil War, World War II. You had to learn to improvise and adapt. Luckily, there was ability to do that. By the late 1970s, I was playing the Vietnam War a lot. Nobody made wargaming figures for a war that had just ended a few years prior. But I learned how to convert World War II GIs to be South Vietnamese infantrymen because they were wearing similar equipment. And you could turn, believe it or not, Confederates into Viet Cong easily enough because they were wearing floppy hats. So you, with a scalpel knife and a box of Band-Aids by your side, you could modify figures, you could do things with paint to change things around, and you could make the armies that you wanted to make. Today, we're spoiled for figures. For example, you can get figures for the First and Second Anglo-Sikh Wars. So there's a lot of cool stuff out there and a lot of things you can do. Now, when it comes to wargaming, you're not just stuck to modern eras. There's a plethora of time periods you can play. Anything in history becomes eligible. You can be playing ancient Romans. You can be playing Napoleonics. For example, here we've got some medieval figures representing Burgundians from the time of Charles the Bold, facing off against some English troops from the War of the Roses. The two eras were contemporary. Charles the Bold, of course, dies in 1477, and the War of the Roses are rampaging wildly at that point. Not that wildly, it just covered a long period of time with short bursts of activity. And you could play this period with a variety of different rules, such as Sword Point or Hail Caesar. These figures in particular are mounted for impetus, but there's options. There's always options. Likewise, if you want to move up a little more in history, you could be playing the English Civil Wars, and this would actually be a fairly decent army for a small game. a battalion of infantry accompanied with a battalion of cavalry, led by Prince Rupert of the Rhine, of course, and some artillery. The English Civil Wars were a neat kind of period. And again, we got a wide variety of rules you could be playing. Baroque, Forlorn Hope, 1644, Warhammer, English Civil War, as well as Pike and Shot, and a wide variety of other rules. You can always even write your own. Interestingly enough, for those of you who are kind of familiar with miniature wargaming, you might be familiar with the Warhammer system. For a while, Warhammer did play with some historical stuff. The rules mechanics are kind of similar. They discontinued the historical aspect of it, but it's kind of a good entry point if you're a Warhammer player and you want to get into historical gaming. You might want to see if you can find a copy of one of Warhammer Ancient Battles or English Civil War. One of the things you should not think is that wargaming is a solitaire or solo exercise. There are plenty of games you can play solo. There are websites devoted to ideas for solitaire play, but it is an interactive hobby that you can play with other people. You should play with other people. Groups can come together and organize games. One person doesn't have to do all the heavy lifting. For example, years ago I was involved in a campaign with the guys I played with where we were playing northern Italy during the latter part of the Renaissance. And we all took possession of a different city-state. We were responsible for paying the troops from that city-state. And we made alliances and all the other things that city-states would do, and occasionally engaged in tabletop battle. Napoleonic campaigns are popular, World War II campaigns. Anything you can game, you can campaign as well. So whether your group has a one-off night playing a battle, or if you string all your battles together to make them meaningful with results carried forward from one game to another, that's something you can do. We've had games with just 2 people playing against each other, which is always fine, to games where an entire group is around one table playing, maybe 8 or 10 wargamers engaged in a large battle. There's a lot of fun you can have. There's a lot of interaction you can have. You can meet a lot of people. You can set up some great relationships as you go through life. And it's a hobby that has a lot of rewards to it, beyond just meeting need for studying military history every now and then. Now, one of the things I'm going to stress, because this is my own personal little bear, is if you buy wargaming figures, they usually come unpainted. You can buy them in metal, you can buy them in plastic, you can buy them in multi-pose plastic where you're gluing the figures together and you're gluing your fingers to the figures, which is what I usually do. What you should do is paint your figures. Some people think it's fine to play with unpainted figures. And in some groups that's acceptable. The groups I've always played with have always had the ethos that it's a sign of respect to your opponent to paint figures. They don't have to be painted expertly. I'm not that great of a painter, despite the fact that I've been doing practically my entire life. Some people are really, really good and have a talent for it. Some people aren't very good at all. But make the effort. It's, like I said, a sign of respect for your fellow gamers, and you'll feel better about the armies you put on the field because you're going to have a personal investment in those armies if you do it. So that's my one little hint from Uncle Tom. Now, one of the things we do at Jefferson Barracks that is miniature wargaming related is we have our Little Wars game day. It's usually in April. Sometimes we have a pandemic instead, and we're not able to do it. We're looking forward to hopefully getting back to that, and we'd love to see you at the Jefferson Barracks Visitor Center playing and rolling dice and having some fun. So keep an eye on our Facebook page, and hopefully there'll be an announcement soon. Thanks for watching.